David, thank you for coming on.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for asking me, Christian.
Now, as we heard from Steve, that the windfall tax wouldn't really cover much at all of the rise in fuel prices and energy. The option of public ownership, you're keen on this idea, I believe.
Yeah, there's lots of good reasons for public ownership of the energy system, and they're all coming together right at this moment. And the price issue is the first one. And gloriously, we have a perfect example of how to do it in the country closest to us, which is France, where the government does own the energy system and the largest supplier, including the largest supplier. And it's decided that instead of a 54% increase in energy bills to customers will only have a 4% increase. So 50% of it, nearly all of it, is going to be carried by the company.
So can I just come in, because you know that's an example of how we could do it. But when we were talking yesterday, you were saying that the government's already been spending on energy companies, but not bringing them into public ownership, but helping them out. Can you tell people about the bulb situation?
Yeah, I can. We're in a position, by accident, we're actually in a wonderful position to do exactly what the French government have done, because as we know, over the last 6 months, 9 months, a whole series of, I think, 29 energy suppliers have collapsed. Normal process is let them collapse, all the customers get transferred to other suppliers, everybody pays a bit extra on their bills, so we pay for it to rescue ourselves from bankrupt private companies. Bulb goes bankrupt, it's too big to fail. There's 1.5 million customers or something. There's no way that other suppliers can accept the transfer of customers. So the government decides we have to rescue Bulb. Now they keep Bulb going. They're pumping money into Bulb. It's going to cost us £2 billion this year, £2 billion of money just to keep Bulb going. This is a failed private company with a failed executive who's been paid £250,000 a year now out of our money. Why on earth are we doing that? People have calculated, the Financial Times and others, that it would be far cheaper, half as much, to simply nationalize Bulb and take it over and say, okay, Bulb customers will be safe because the government has taken them over and will continue to supply with electricity. Why don't we do that? I think the reason why we don't do that, even though it's blindingly obvious and a simple, clear solution, is because once the government actually created, unintentionally, a publicly owned supply company, people around the country would slowly realize, and a trickle would rapidly become a flood, that this is the energy supplier to be with. Any of these suppliers can go bust any moment. If you're with the government supplier, the public supplier, that's where the buck stops. We know the buck stops there. So let's all be there. And that's the reason, I think, why the government is spending all this money to pretend to keep going this zombie wreck of a failed private company, rather than bring it into public ownership, which would enable the government then to do exactly what the French government has done. We will only increase prices by 4%.
And the other thing that we spoke about yesterday was you talked about the national grid and how much money they're making when they're not actually supplying any. They're not involved in this gas increase. They're just taking money. And you think that that's a way that if we did bring a gas supplier into public ownership, that we could afford that with the national grid? Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, no, that's okay. No, you got it basically right. As most people probably know, the energy industry, the electricity industry, to be precise, has been split into 3 layers. There's the supply end, which is the useless companies that sell us the thing. There's the grid that channels the electricity around the country, and then behind them there's generators. We'll come to them in a bit, but let's look at the grid. Even without nationalizing bulb, actually, there's simple things we can do with the grid, because we calculated 2-3 years ago that the owners, the shareholders of the grid companies, between them are taking out of the system every year something like £3 billion more than would be necessary under public ownership. Now, the problem of the transition is the demand for compensation, etc., etc. But it's clear that what's been happening is the grid companies have quietly upped their charges to make even more profit. How do we know that? Because the shares of the national grid and Scottish and Southern have gone up by 20% more than the general trend of the stock market in the last 6 to 9 months. By comparison, the shares of EDF, the Electricité de France, that are traded have gone down by 30% more than the trend. So you can tell which companies are making money. We want to claw that back, and the way to do it is simply introduce a price cap on the grids. Ofgem's supposed to regulate them, but they failed to do so. We introduce a price cap, like we did for the supply companies, and we calculate that supply cap. You can charge for all your actual operating costs, but in this time of crisis, there will be zero taken out in dividends. At a stroke, that will save us, just the dividend element alone, that will save us about £2.5 billion a year. That we can use to finance the deficit of Bulb once it's publicly owned, because if we're not putting up prices, Bulb will have a deficit, but it will be ours. But we can get that back off the companies, and that will genuinely make the shareholders pay, because it'll be their dividends we are keeping in our hands to support our prices.
Well, I mean, that's it. That's a pretty watertight way of showing how we could stop those energy bills going up for customers, whatever they're called, people is the word for people, and then also how we can bring public ownership in, because the government in a way is already doing that, but also you identified that the government has been nationalizing some parts of the country anyway, with no fanfare. So the government isn't really against nationalization per se. It just doesn't want people to know about it. Can you tell us about those bits of nationalization that you've worked out have been going on?
Yeah, very good, very good, perfect summary. It's something called a paper called Future System Operator, which was produced at the beginning of last month by the government, announcing a wonderful new policy. Ministerial Forward declares, we will confirm the view, a new independent future system operator can play a vital part helping us meet these challenges. We will establish the future system operator of the energy system in public ownership. They then say, in a way that ensures it's truly and properly independent, including independent from government, which isn't very helpful, but they have announced they are going to create a body under public ownership whose job is to overall play a key role in coordinating and strategic planning across the sector. We acknowledge this will affect the current operators owned by National Grid, because the FSO will be taking over some of the roles and capabilities and will involve a transfer of ownership. Right. Don't worry, National Grid, they have. We will pay you hundreds of millions in compensation for this little bit of the grid. Not the whole grid. They're not nationalising the whole grid, but they're nationalising a bit. So we can see how the government, which has laboured over this for about 5 years, has been forced into the conclusion that to have any sensible chance of doing anything with an energy system, you need public ownership in there at the heart of it. And they're going ahead and proposing it in an utterly inadequate way, but they are proposing a new publicly owned central planning agency company for the energy system. Now, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to say these proposals are quite inadequate, but we can use this. we can actually welcome the creation, it seems to me, of a future system operator and say it should do what its name suggests. It should become the operator of the system. It should become the owner of Bulb. As the grid companies, if we put price caps on the grid companies that prevent them taking out dividends, the share prices will go south very, very rapidly, which will make compensation much less of an issue. And so both the potential for and the desirability of bringing the grid companies into public ownership be more obvious. And if you have a company like that, you can use it to do that. But as far as I'm aware, I've not noticed any comment coming from the opposition, and actually remarkably little publicity about it, because, as you say, the government can see, even this government can see the need for public ownership on such an important system, but they don't want any public fuss about them nationalising it. But that's what they're starting to do.